Eye of the Beholder. Marina Sirtis says if the writers can't give her a decent episode, she's going to kill herself.
The Enterprise crew is working to stop plasma being ejected from one of the warp nacelles.
So there's a lot going wrong on the ship, including all of the camera stabilization, because a lot of those shots are tilted as hell. There were a lot of unconventional camera shots during this opening. It was pretty cool.
Riker and Worf track the cause down to a disgruntled employee named Dan Kwan.
Probably because he saw the end result of his makeup for this episode.
Definitely one of the weirder designs, I think. Riker tries to find out why Kwan did it, but he just says some ambiguous things about people laughing at him, probably because of the way he looks. And before Riker can stop him, Kwan jumps into the plasmonic verticulating discombobulator and is vaporized.
And Riker is very dismayed because that dude still owed him a lunch.
I'm never going to get that free lunch that I get every day anyway. The officers get together to discuss Kwan, and Riker and Troi say he seemed positive in the preceding days and weeks.
And Riker said that before he jumped, Kwan didn't even seem to recognize him. And Troi said during crew evaluations he seemed fine. Picard says this is his first suicide, which was honestly pretty surprising. I would think that with all the stuff that they run into, some people would just lose their minds and kill themselves, but I guess not. Worf suggests that there might be some evidence of Kwan's actions, and Troi says she's more than willing to break into his personal logs. And we can see how annoyed Worf is that Troi is blatantly suggesting violating security protocol.
Picard gives his permission, and then he tells Geordi that they also have permission to exceed the warp speed limit to help with their current mission.
Proving how little he really cares about Kwan's suicide, since that woman from that episode killed herself to prevent people from going too fast in space.
Data asks Geordi why someone would commit suicide, and Geordi says Kwan must have felt there was something wrong in his life that he was powerless to fix. Data relates that to when he was first activated and his neural net was developing.
His neural pathways kept conflicting as they grew, and the safest and easiest way to treat the issue would have been to shut himself down, but ultimately he chose not to.
Troi and Worf break into Kwan's quarters and discuss the fact that he gave no sign that anything was wrong.
They find a picture of his girlfriend, as well as a personal log saying he's looking forward to spending time with his girlfriend, so they go to talk to his girlfriend.
His girlfriend, Calloway, says that Kwan felt that his superior at the nacelle station, Lieutenant Nara, felt threatened by him.
And Calloway smiles as she reminisces about how she felt like Kwan was so sensitive to her feelings, and Troi just shatters that by telling her that Kwan's species is empathic, you dumb ass.
And at one point, Calloway says, "It's not like Dan to take his own life."
I thought that's such a weird way to phrase that,
yeah,
too.
I expected her to follow up with, "He's never done it before."
And then Troi points out he has multiple lives, you dumbass.
That doesn't make sense.
Troi goes to the nacelle station where she's surprised by Lieutenant Nara, so I guess her species can't be read by their emotions or thoughts.
Nara says there didn't seem to be anything wrong with Kwan, and that he knew the ship better than anyone because he helped build it. Troi looks around the area and has a strange negative reaction when she goes up to where Kwan was standing when he jumped into the discombobulator.
So Beverly checks her out, and Troi claims there were intense negative emotions in that spot, but there was no one there to emit them.
And at this point, I assumed that the writers were tired of having Data go crazy every other episode and decided to put Troi in that position instead.
Riker wonders if Kwan could have left an empathic echo after he killed himself, which is pretty wild, and you would think that if that were the case, there would be empathic echoes all over the place if all it takes is having an intense emotional reaction.
Yeah, imagine being in a place on Beta Z where a bunch of people died.
What about just walking by the bathroom when someone took a massive dump? Can't you just see Troi getting all disoriented and leaning over the railing about to throw up because she's just feeling it herself?
Beverly points out that the feelings match those of someone about to commit suicide. Riker tells Worf to go with Troi the next time she revisits the area. I would think they would have more than one person with her, but I guess not. Later, Worf visits Troi in her quarters, and she says to Worf, "Can I get you anything?" But it's not like she's offering to make him something. She's standing at a replicator that he is also very close to. That kind of bothered me.
It was just her being polite. Worf asks her about other empathic experiences she's had, and she recalls listening to the telepathic stories of her grandfather and how she can still hear him inside her head when she's sitting next to the fire.
And she laughs at her grandfather's racist remarks.
My grandfather rarely spoke. He said, that was for off-worlders and people who didn't know any better.
Worf gets all metaphysical, but then leaves right as the conversation gets interesting.
In 10 Forward, he talks to Riker, who is in his side job as a gigolo, and he awkwardly tells Riker that he would never move in on his girl without getting his okay first. Riker laughs at his awkwardness, and Worf awkwardly leaves, awkwardly taking his awkwardness with him.
Worf and Troi go back to the nacelle station, and Troi again stands up on the platform and tells Worf to open the door. Based on her earlier experiences, I would have expected Worf to be standing right up there with her, but he instead chooses to stand way down on the floor. And then she tells him to open the door, and I'm glad he expressed some hesitation and asked what she was looking for, but he gave up way too easily when she just says, "I don't know, open the door."
And she ends up experiencing a vision of a woman being menaced by someone.
She then finds herself alone in the room, which is now unfinished.
She finds a door that she opens by pushing a button, even though non-automatic doors seem to be alien to everyone else in earlier episodes, and she finds a couple making out.
They spot her and start laughing at her, and then she zaps back to reality.
They have a meeting about it, where Troi says that it was like seeing things through someone else's eyes, and they speculate if it could have all been something that Kwan saw.
Troi says she didn't recognize anyone in her vision except Boggs, but could not place him.
Picard tells her to look through the personnel files of the shipyard where the Enterprise was being built, and she says she wants to check out the nacelle area again. Beverly says she can suppress her empathic abilities so she won't be as strongly affected.
Later, Troy's searching through everyone who worked on building the Enterprise, but there are a lot of people. And Worf suggests narrowing the search parameters, and she says she has, but she was just looking at a picture of a woman, and I would think that parameter would be pretty easy to narrow.
She finally finds the menacing man, who is named Walter Pierce, so they go to talk to him in engineering.
He's played by Mark Ralston, who I recognize from The Shawshank Redemption, Aliens, Eraser, Rush Hour, and it's been seasons since we've had an actor from RoboCop 2. There was that stretch where a bunch of sequential episodes had someone from RoboCop 2, so I'm glad we're finally getting back to representing that masterpiece.
That's what the show was really missing.
They grill him pretty forcefully, despite not really knowing anything.
And at one point he casually touches a panel, and I'm sure narrowly avoids blowing up the ship. And Troi reminds him and the writers that she can sense when someone is lying.
She uses it as a threat, which is just what you want to see from your superiors. Them threatening you with their ability to easily destroy you at any time.
When Troi and Worf leave, she tells him that she couldn't read Pierce even though he is human, and they both say they felt he was hiding something.
Troi says she wants to access logs from the shipyard where the Enterprise was built, but says it will take a while. And it was pretty crazy how she touched 2 buttons before the computer performed exactly what she wanted to do. Must be using ChatGPT.
Worf says they should continue in the morning because it's late. They awkwardly keep saying goodnight, and they'll get back to it tomorrow. Worf finally decides to make his move despite her apparent lack of interest, but she reciprocates despite her apparent lack of interest.
Then we cut to a commercial while they do the deed. The next morning, Beverly, with her telepathic sense of when there's some juicy gossip to spread, pings both of them back to back.
Beverly gives Troi her empathic inhibitor, and when she says she's going to the nacelle station, Worf says he has to stay to help with something, and Troi immediately gets jealous when she sees him interacting with Calloway.
In the nacelle station, Geordi and Data say they haven't found anything unusual, and on the platform, Troi notices a conduit that she wants to take a closer look at. Nara indicates that Kwan was working on a panel that hadn't been opened since the ship was built, and I suspected that wasn't true, because What's-Her-Face claimed to have been exploring all parts of the ship to find the most acoustically fit spot for music, and I'll bet she was in there at one point.
Behind this panel in the wall. When Geordi opens up the panel, Troi gets a flash of Pierce menacing the girl, so Geordi shines some kind of magic beam that reveals a human skeleton.
Which was pretty dark for this show.
And I thought it would have been cooler if they had Geordi pick up something with his visor first, instead of having Data detect organic material that made him decide to shine the beam.
I thought it would have been cool if they opened the panel and a skeleton just fell out on him. In sickbay, Beverly just keeps pumping Troi full of more drugs that will supposedly work this time, even though that's what she said last time.
Troi notices Worf leaning over Calloway as they pull up the records of the woman that the remains belong to.
They find out it's a woman named Marla Finn, and I loved how Worf immediately went to the most horrific cause of her being behind that wall.
Maybe there was some kind of an accident.
Or she was killed, and the murderer hid her remains.
They pull up Kwan's records, which show that he didn't arrive at the shipyard until after the woman disappeared, so Troy's vision couldn't have been from his perspective.
And they determine it was actually the only other person who's been given a name in this episode, Pierce.
And they speculate that he might have some telepathic abilities. And Troi realizes the reason she saw him in her vision was because she was looking at his reflection. Worf thanks Calloway for her help, which again gets Troy's attention.
Worf and Troy go to talk to Pierce, and on the way, Troy asks Worf if he regrets what happened the night before, and says she doesn't feel herself. So Worf reassures her and goes to talk to Pierce alone.
Which was a stupid idea, instead of getting a security team with him.
We cut to later that night, where Troy's expecting Worf, but Pierce walks in instead.
And Pierce tells her that Worf said she wanted to see him, so she asks the computer where Worf is, and it tells her he's in Calloway's quarters.
Troy has security hold Pierce while she goes to confront Worf, and when the door opens, Worf and Calloway are kissing and start laughing at Troy. So she grabs a phaser and kills Worf.
She runs out into the hall and encounters Pierce, who says, "You know what you have to do." So she runs to the nacelle and prepares to jump into the discombobulator. But unfortunately, Worf stops her just in time, and she is happy to see that he is still alive.
Later, it's revealed that all of Troy's perceived events, starting from her first vision, happened in just a few seconds.
And it was all in her head.
Data reveals that Pierce was a partial betazoid, so I guess they just missed that when investigating earlier, despite all the evidence being pretty clear.
Troy says she believes that Pierce found out the other two were having an affair and killed them, then jumped into the discombobulator.
Geordi enters and drops an explanation that I had to watch 3 times to understand what the he was talking about.
Yeah, something about traces of cellular residue showing a psionic signature. And I really wanted to know how you could find a psionic signature from traces of cellular residue. And I like how it's traces of cellular residue. Isn't cellular residue already a trace of something? And Troy gives some kind of explanation involving subspace energy and psychic patterns, saying that her mind created a situation similar to Pierce's.
Yeah, my note says insert the quote of Troy's whatever explanation.
The subspace energy present there imprinted his empathic pattern into the residue.
So now that everything's wrapped up, Worf and Troy discuss her relief at seeing him alive, and she explains what happened. But they're doing it right there on the bridge around a bunch of other people who have no idea what's been happening in this episode. And if I were standing around getting coffee and the CEO and CFO were discussing murdering each other in their crazy hallucinations, I'd probably find another job.
And Troy even ends with a not at all funny joke about it.
Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Eye of the Beholder. Overall?
Like many episodes this season, this one felt like one we've seen multiple times before, with Troy being manipulated in some way. I don't remember those others being especially interesting, and neither was this one. The fact that most of the episode didn't even really happen just makes things worse. That idea reminded me of a bunch of other episodes that also generally weren't that great, where people were going crazy or whatever.
But I thought that this episode handled the reveal a little bit better. It wasn't as obvious as some of those other episodes.
I guess that part is true, but the fact that it came at the very end and they just kind of glossed over it and said, hey, half this episode didn't really happen, was not exactly satisfying.
I agree.
I mostly liked the development of the romance between Worf and Troy, and it was cool to see them bring that up again, but now we know it didn't really happen, so it probably doesn't matter. That was also very satisfying. The psychic residual murder visions thing was an interesting idea, but I felt like they didn't do a whole lot with it, and their explanation left a lot to be desired. Not having half the episode turn out to just be in Troy's head could have improved things significantly by having it all be a scheme by Pierce to try to avoid getting caught, which is what I thought was happening, and it would have made it more similar to those other Troy manipulation episodes, but it would have been much more satisfying than just throwing a little twist in at the end that voids half of what you just watched. I did like the idea that a murder victim's body had been hidden in the Enterprise. I feel like that would end up being just kind of like a weird trivia fact in Starfleet.
And they never do any sort of scan around the ship that would reveal there was a skeleton behind that wall.
Yeah, wouldn't the Baryon sweep have gotten rid of that residual cellular whatever?
Maybe that should have been the explanation. They accidentally left somebody on the ship, and they were locked behind that door, and the Baryon sweep just wiped them out.
I didn't think this episode was that bad, but its lack of original plot ideas and that ending twist that made it feel like it was a waste of time and that super quick wrap-up just made it all very disappointing. I gave it a D+.
I gave it a C. I also like the organicness of Worf moving towards starting a relationship with Troy based on their conversations in this episode and his experiences in Parallels. And now that Troy has had a similar, not real experience where they're together, maybe they'll actually get together. And she can say, remember that time I shot you in the chest and killed you? And he can respond, yeah, remember that time I abandoned you and our kids? And they'll just laugh and laugh.
Even though neither of them would remember the thing that the other one is talking about.
It's all good. The fact that most of this episode happened inside Troy's head was interesting, if, like you said, rehashed. I thought that this episode did a better job of keeping that under wraps. I also really hated this ending. It was like the writers realized they had no way out and only 3 minutes of runtime left, so they just said, whatever. You said it would have been better if Pierce was responsible, but I was actually hoping for the real twist to be that Calloway was responsible for everything. Because they never investigated her outside of knowing she was Kwan's girlfriend, so they could have made her telepathic, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. I don't know what her motivation would have been, but I'm not a writer on the show. I just know that that ending would have been more satisfying.
I actually did kind of think at first that might be what was going on because the actress was not very good. It felt like she was fake acting, and I wondered if she was doing that on purpose in the show. And she didn't really seem that upset about Kwan dying, even though she said she was.
I mean, I know you're just saying that because I brought it up right now, and you're saying, I'm going to piggyback off of Nick's idea. It sounds like a good one.
Uh-huh.
The camera work in this episode stood out, and not just in the opening. It took a different direction than what we've seen lately, which was cool, and I liked it. And even though Pierce was behind everything, and the events happened 8 years ago, it was out of a moment of anger and betrayal. Was he just an evil person to begin with? Because we didn't really get much more backstory, and it seemed like the other two were the assholes, not him. Granted, he should not have murdered them, but it was weird how the show painted only him in a negative light, and not really the other two.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially since he ended up killing himself.
I didn't think this episode was as bad as you say.
I didn't think it was good enough for a C because of how much it felt like a waste of time by the time it was done.
Maybe I'm being influenced by the past couple episodes, because those were really bad. I was thinking Masks and the Ghost one.
Yeah, Sub Rosa.
Yeah. So even though things were recycled, it was a little refresher. Gotta get me to that finale, which everyone says is really good.
However, you have to lie to yourself to keep things going.
We gotta keep going. We're so close. It would be so dumb to stop now.
I don't know. I'm debating it. No, don't.